Sometimes the deepest wounds come from the people we love most, and the questions they leave behind when they disappear. At 61, Lena Rowe thought she had made peace with her father's absence and the hollow ache in her heart. Returning to her father's woodland property with her aging German shepherd, Lena sought refuge from a life heavy with regrets. Instead, she discovered something that would shatter everything she believed about her family. Hidden in the forest, covered by thick vine, sat an old military helicopter. Inside were classified files, her father's flight jacket, and a voice recorder containing long-buried secrets. What she found would reveal why her father never came home. But was she prepared for answers that might destroy everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel crunched beneath Lena's worn hiking boots as she stepped out of her aging Honda Pilot, breathing in the crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and decades of memories. The 2-hour drive from Denver had given her too much time to think, but not nearly enough to prepare for standing here again after 15 years of deliberate avoidance. Boone emerged slowly from the passenger seat, his once powerful frame moving with the careful deliberation of his 12 years. The German shepherd's muzzle had turned white, and his joints protested each movement. But his dark eyes still held the intelligence and loyalty that had sustained Lena through 3 deployments and 2 tours that she preferred not to discuss. Even with herself. "We're here, old boy," she murmured, running her fingers through his thick coat. A home, I suppose, though it never felt much like one. The cabin stood exactly as she remembered, weathered cedar logs that had turned silver grey over the decades, a stone chimney that her father had built with his own hands, and windows that needed cleaning, but still caught the afternoon light, filtering through the towering pines. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on the eastern corner, and the metal roof showed patches where her father had made repairs that now seemed like archaeological evidence of a life lived in careful solitude. She pulled her duffel bag from the back of the SUV, along with enough supplies for a week, maybe longer if she could stand her own company that long. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months ago, though the marriage had been over for years before Marcus finally admitted what she'd known all along, that living with someone who kept her deepest wounds sealed behind military precision was exhausting, even for a fellow veteran who understood the cost of service. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd inherited her father's gift for emotional distance, the same trait that had driven him away from their family when she was 17. Different wars, same scars, same inability to bridge the gap between duty and love. Sarah had stopped taking her calls 2 weeks ago, and David had been lost to her since his teenage years, when her deployment schedule and rigid expectations had convinced him she valued her career more than his baseball games and science fairs. At 31, he was successful and polite when family obligations demanded interaction. But the easy affection they'd shared when he was small had been replaced by the kind of careful courtesy reserved for strangers. 61 years old, she said to Boone, who was investigating a familiar patch of grass near the porch steps. "And the only male who still likes my company is the one who can't tell me what a disappointment I've become." The key was exactly where her father had always kept it, under the loose board, third from the left on the porch steps. Some things apparently never changed. The cabin's interior smelled of old wood and the faint residue of tobacco from her father's pipe, a scent that had somehow survived more than 4 decades. She'd expected the place to feel smaller, the way childhood spaces always did when revisited through adult eyes, but instead it felt vast and empty, filled with the echoes of conversations they'd never had and explanations he'd never offered. The main room was dominated by a stone fireplace and built-in bookshelves that held an eclectic collection reflecting her father's wide-ranging interests: military history, engineering texts, field guides to local flora and fauna, and poetry collections that had surprised her when she'd first discovered them as a teenager. A faded military photograph sat on the mantel. Her father in his dress uniform, with the kind of straight-backed posture and distant gaze that she recognized in her own service photos. Captain James Rowe, decorated helicopter pilot, devoted soldier, and absent father. The photograph captured him at perhaps 35, confident and capable, with no hint of the man who would disappear into the mountains of Southeast Asia and never return. Looking at it now, Lena was struck by how much she resembled him, the same strong jawline, the same habit of holding her shoulders just a fraction too high, as if braced for incoming fire. She'd been 17 when the military chaplain came to their door, with the news that her father was missing in action, his helicopter having gone down during what they called a routine reconnaissance mission. Her mother had received the flag and the official condolences, but no body, no answers, and no closure. Within 2 years, her mother had remarried and moved to Florida, leaving Lena to navigate her senior year of high school and her own military aspirations with nothing but questions and a cabin in the Colorado mountains that no one seemed to want. The army had been her answer, structure, purpose, and a place where her father's absence felt less like abandonment and more like inspiration. She'd followed his path into aviation, earned her wings flying Black Hawks, and discovered that she had inherited more than his stubborn chin and his inability to express affection. She could read terrain like a map, navigate by instinct, and land a helicopter in spaces that shouldn't accommodate anything larger than a bird. But she'd also inherited his talent for leaving, for choosing duty over family, for believing that serving something larger than herself was worth the cost of the smaller, more precious things that required daily tending. Marcus had tried to explain it to her during one of their final counseling sessions, his voice patient but weary. "You're always preparing for the next mission, Lena. Even when you're home, you're not really here." He'd been right, of course. Even now, standing in her father's cabin with her marriage behind her and her children estranged, she felt the familiar urge to assess and secure, to identify potential threats and plan contingencies. It was exhausting, this constant state of readiness for battles that never came. But it was also the only way she knew how to be in the world. Boone settled himself on the rug in front of the fireplace, with a deep sigh that seemed to echo her own feelings. They were both too old for new beginnings, too tired for grand gestures of reconciliation or reinvention. They'd come here because it was quiet, because it was away from the wreckage of her civilian life, and because sometimes a person needed to sit with their ghosts before they could figure out how to live with them. She unpacked methodically, hanging clothes in the cedar closet where her father's old flannel shirts still occupied the left side, their sleeves pressed and ready as if he might return at any moment to claim them. In the kitchen, she found canned goods dated from the previous year. Someone had been maintaining the place, probably the property management company that handled the taxes and basic upkeep. Everything was clean but impersonal, like a vacation rental rather than a home. The refrigerator held basics: milk, eggs, bread that was still fresh. Whoever had prepared for her arrival had anticipated a longer stay than she'd originally planned. Perhaps her lawyer had been more specific about her situation than she'd realized. Or perhaps the locals understood that people came to places like this when they needed time to figure out what came next. As evening approached, she built a fire using the same technique her father had taught her during their brief childhood visits. The muscle memory was still there, the arrangement of kindling, the positioning of logs, the patience required to coax flame from ember. She'd used these skills in places where fire meant survival, where the difference between warmth and hypothermia could determine mission success or failure. But sitting here now, watching the flames dance while Boone dozed at her feet, she found herself remembering not the tactical applications, but the simple pleasure of a warm cabin and the smell of wood smoke. Her father had taught her to build fires before he'd taught her to march or to identify aircraft silhouettes. There had been a time, however brief, when he'd been simply a father rather than a soldier, preparing his daughter for a world that would demand everything she had to give. Outside, the forest settled into its evening rhythm. The soft hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine boughs. It was peaceful in a way that her life hadn't been for longer than she could remember. And for the first time in months, she felt her shoulders begin to relax. Tomorrow, she thought, she would explore the property more thoroughly. There were trails she remembered from childhood, clearings where her father had taught her to identify animal tracks and edible plants. Maybe walking would help her sort through the tangle of regret and resentment that had brought her here. Maybe the woods would offer some clarity about what to do with the rest of her life. Now that the structure of marriage and career no longer provided direction, the photograph on the mantel caught her eye again. Her father's face serious but not unkind, looking toward a future that would ultimately claim him. She wondered if he'd ever imagined his daughter ending up here, alone, except for an aging dog, searching for answers to questions that should have been asked decades ago. "What would you tell me now, Dad?" she asked the empty room. "What would you say about the mess I've made of everything you thought I was strong enough to handle?" The fire crackled in response, offering warmth but no wisdom, companionship but no conversation. Outside, the Colorado night deepened, wrapping the cabin in a silence that felt both comforting and profound. For now, it was enough to be here, to breathe air that didn't carry the weight of other people's expectations or disappointments. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight belonged to rest and the simple pleasure of a fire well built. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, filtering through the pine canopy in long shafts of golden light that reminded Lena why her father had chosen this place. She woke to Boone's gentle nudging, his internal clock more reliable than any alarm after years of military precision. The coffee was strong and black, the way she'd learned to drink it during early morning briefings when sugar and cream were luxuries that slowed down the process of getting airborne. The morning air carried a bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. She dressed in layers, thermal underwear, flannel shirt, and the worn canvas jacket that had seen 3 deployments and countless civilian adventures. Boone waited patiently by the door, his tail moving in the slow, measured wag of an old dog who understood that good things required patience. "Ready for a walk, old boy?" she asked, though his answer was evident in the way he pushed, his nose against her hand, and moved toward the door with more energy than he'd shown the previous evening. The trail began just beyond the cabin's eastern border, marked by a wooden post that her father had installed decades ago. The path was overgrown but still visible, worn into the earth by years of use and maintained by the passage of deer and other wildlife. Pine needles and fallen leaves created a soft carpet that muffled their footsteps, making their progress through the forest feel almost reverential. Lena found herself falling into the rhythm of the walk, her breathing synchronizing with Boone's steady pace and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. This was one of the few good memories she had of her father, their early morning hikes when she was young, before his deployments became longer and his presence at home became more sporadic. He taught her to move quietly through the woods, to observe without disturbing, to read the stories written in tracks and broken branches. "See that?" he'd say, pointing to scratches on a tree trunk or a depression in the soil. "Everything that passes through here leaves a sign. The trick is learning how to read what the forest is telling you." She'd thought it was just woodcraft then, the kind of practical knowledge that fathers passed to children who spent summers in remote places. Only later did she understand that he was teaching her surveillance techniques, skills that would serve her well in places where reading the landscape could mean the difference between completing a mission and never coming home. The trail forked after the first mile, one branch leading toward the creek that ran along the property's northern boundary, the other climbing toward a ridge that offered views of the valley below. Lena chose the ridge path, partly for the exercise and partly because she remembered the way morning light looked from that elevation, spreading across the forest like a blessing. Boone began to slow as they climbed, his breathing becoming labored in the thin mountain air. She paused frequently to let him rest, using the breaks to study the forest around them and to notice changes that had occurred in her 15-year absence. Storms had taken down several large pines, creating clearings where younger trees now competed for sunlight. A beaver dam had altered the creek's course, creating a small wetland where none had existed before. It was during one of these rest stops, perhaps 2 miles from the cabin, that Boone suddenly became alert in a way that made Lena's training kick in. His ears pricked forward, and he turned his head toward a section of forest that looked no different from any other. Dense undergrowth, mature trees, the kind of terrain that required careful navigation. "What is it, boy?" she asked, following his gaze and seeing nothing unusual. But Boone was insistent, pushing through the undergrowth with surprising determination for a dog who'd been panting from the climb moments before. Lena followed, pushing aside low-hanging branches and stepping carefully over fallen logs, trusting the instincts that had kept them both alive through situations far more dangerous than a morning walk in familiar woods. The first thing she noticed was the unnatural straightness of a line among the organic curves of the forest. Metal, she realized, though it was so covered with vines and moss that it was almost invisible. As she moved closer, more details became apparent. The curve of what might be a rotor blade, the angular edge of a fuselage, the distinctive twin rotor configuration that she recognized immediately. A CH-47 Chinook helicopter sat in a natural clearing, so completely overgrown with vegetation that it seemed to be growing from the forest floor itself. Decades of neglect had turned the aircraft into something that belonged more to nature than to the military. Its olive-drab paint job now decorated with rust stains and the green patina of plant life that had claimed it as their own. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized not just the aircraft type, but the specific markings that were still visible beneath the vegetation. This wasn't just any abandoned helicopter. This was a military aircraft, and from the style of markings and the degree of weathering, it had been here for decades. Her father had flown Chinooks. The realization hit her like a physical blow, making her reach for the nearest tree for support. Boone seemed to sense her distress, moving close to her side and pressing his warm bulk against her leg in the way he'd learned to do during her difficult moments. The helicopter sat before them like a ghost made manifest, a piece of her father's world that had somehow found its way to his private sanctuary. She circled the aircraft slowly, noting details that confirmed her growing suspicion. The tail number was partially obscured, but she could make out enough digits to know that this aircraft had been in service during her father's era. The configuration was right, the size was right, and the location, hidden deep in the woods on her father's property, suggested a connection that her rational mind wanted to reject, but her heart recognized as inevitable. How had it gotten here? Military aircraft didn't simply disappear into private forests without explanation. There should have been investigations, recovery efforts, official inquiries. The army didn't lose helicopters and then forget about them, especially not in the mountains of Colorado. Unless, she thought with growing unease, this helicopter wasn't supposed to exist in any official capacity. The cargo bay doors were partially open, revealing an interior dark with shadows and decades of accumulated debris. Lena found herself drawn toward the opening, despite every instinct that warned her to proceed carefully. This felt like crossing a threshold, like opening a door that had been deliberately closed. "Dad, what were you involved in?" she whispered to the forest, her voice barely audible above the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Boone had positioned himself near the helicopter's nose, sitting at attention in the way he'd been trained to do when something required her focused attention. His posture was alert but not alarmed. Whatever secrets this aircraft held, they didn't represent an immediate threat. Lena pulled out her phone to take pictures, though she knew the photos would never capture the full impact of seeing this machine in its forest cathedral, surrounded by towering pines and carpeted with decades of fallen leaves. The lack of cell service this deep in the mountains meant the images would remain private until she returned to civilization, giving her time to decide what, if anything, to do with this discovery. As she documented the helicopter from every angle, she found herself remembering conversations with her father about his service, the careful way he'd always described his duties, the vague references to missions that couldn't be discussed in detail. She'd assumed he was simply observing standard operational security protocols, but now she wondered if there had been other reasons for his reticence. The morning sun had risen higher, sending stronger beams of light through the canopy and illuminating details that had been hidden in shadow. Serial numbers, maintenance markings, modifications that looked like they'd been made in the field rather than at a proper facility. This helicopter had seen hard use before it had been abandoned to the forest, and the more she studied it, the more questions arose about how it had come to rest here, standing in that hidden clearing, surrounded by the silence of the deep woods and the weight of decades-old mysteries. Lena felt a familiar sensation, the mixture of anticipation and dread that came with the beginning of a mission whose scope and dangers couldn't yet be fully understood. She'd found something that shouldn't exist, in a place where it couldn't logically be, connected to a father who had left more questions than answers. Whatever this helicopter represented, whatever story it held, she knew she couldn't simply walk away and pretend she'd never seen it. The daughter of Captain James Rowe, missing in action for over 40 years, had just discovered a piece of military hardware that might finally provide some answers to questions that had shaped her entire adult life. The forest kept its secrets well, but some secrets, once discovered, demanded to be understood. The return trip to the cabin felt different, weighted with purpose and the kind of nervous energy that Lena recognized from pre-mission briefings. Boone seemed to understand that their morning walk had transformed into something more significant, staying close to her side as they navigated the forest path with new urgency. Back at the cabin, she gathered supplies with the methodical precision that had served her well in hostile environments. A heavy-duty flashlight, work gloves, a multi-tool that had been with her through 3 deployments, and a small crowbar from her father's workshop. She also grabbed a waterproof camera bag and her old field notebook. Habits from her military service, where documentation often meant the difference between mission success and costly mistakes. The walk back to the helicopter site took less time now that she knew the route. Her steps confident despite the irregular terrain. Boone moved with renewed energy, as if he too understood that they were crossing from observation into action. The forest seemed different in the later morning light, less mysterious, more cooperative, as if it had decided to reveal rather than conceal its secrets. The helicopter waited exactly as they'd left it, a monument to questions that demanded answers. In better light, Lena could see more details that had been hidden in shadow during their first encounter. The aircraft had definitely been modified in the field, additional communications equipment mounted externally, fuel tank modifications that suggested extended range capabilities, and what looked like medical equipment mounting points that wouldn't have been standard for a transport helicopter. She began with the cargo bay, using the crowbar to carefully pry open doors that had been warped by decades of weather and settling. The interior smelled of old metal, hydraulic fluid, and something else she couldn't immediately identify, something organic that had probably been alive once but was now just part of the forest's slow process of reclamation. The cargo area was larger than it appeared from outside, designed to carry substantial loads or numerous personnel. Most of the space was empty now, filled only with debris from the forest canopy and the accumulated detritus of decades. But her flashlight beam caught something that made her heart race, a military-issue waterproof container, the kind used to protect sensitive materials in harsh environments. The container was secured to the floor with straps that had somehow remained intact despite everything. Getting it free required considerable effort with the crowbar, but eventually the clasps yielded and the case came loose. It was heavier than she'd expected, and when she shook it gently, she could hear the rustle of papers inside. Back in the cabin, with Boone settled beside her chair and afternoon light streaming through the windows, Lena opened the container with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside, wrapped in additional waterproof material, were folders bearing official military markings and classification stamps that made her breath catch. Classified, Operation Nightfall. Eyes only. Her father's name appeared on several of the documents, along with signatures she didn't recognize, and authorization codes that meant nothing to her civilian understanding but everything to her military experience. These weren't routine transport manifests or maintenance records. These were operational orders for missions that weren't supposed to exist in any official capacity. The briefing documents painted a picture that challenged everything. She thought she knew about her father's final deployment. Operation Nightfall had been a series of humanitarian extraction missions designed to evacuate civilians from areas where official military presence couldn't be acknowledged. The locations were listed in code, but she recognized enough geographical references to place them in Southeast Asia, in regions where American forces weren't supposed to be operating. Captain James Rowe had been the primary pilot for these missions. His helicopter configured for long-range operations in hostile territory. The mission parameters were unlike anything in standard military doctrine. Small teams, minimal support, extraction of non-combatants from situations where conventional rescue operations would have created international incidents. As she read deeper into the files, a pattern emerged that made her stomach clench with growing understanding. These weren't random humanitarian missions. They were extraction operations for intelligence assets and their families, for civilians who had helped American forces and were now marked for death by enemy forces, for people whose survival depended on operations that couldn't officially exist. Her father hadn't been flying routine reconnaissance missions when he disappeared. He'd been running covert operations that walked the line between heroism and treason, depending on one's perspective and access to classified information. The official records that had reached her family, the sanitized version of events that mentioned routine patrols and mechanical failures, had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect ongoing operations. One document in particular stopped her cold. A mission briefing dated just 3 days before her father was reported missing, detailing an extraction operation for a village of civilians who had been providing intelligence on enemy troop movements. The mission was classified as high risk, with multiple contingency plans and explicit instructions that under no circumstances should the operation be acknowledged if discovered. The final page of the briefing contained a handwritten note in her father's distinctive script. "These people trusted us. They put their families at risk because they believed we would protect them. We don't get to choose who's worth saving." Lena set the document down with trembling hands, finally understanding the weight her father had carried. He hadn't been just a soldier following orders. He'd been making life and death decisions about people whose names would never appear in history books, whose sacrifices would never be acknowledged by the governments they'd helped. The implications began to cascade through her understanding like dominoes falling. If her father had been flying covert missions when he disappeared, then his loss wasn't the result of mechanical failure or enemy action during routine operations. He'd been engaged in operations so sensitive that even his disappearance had to be explained away with comfortable lies. But why was this helicopter here, on his property in Colorado? How had classified military hardware ended up in a forest clearing hundreds of miles from any official installation? The logistics alone suggested resources and planning that went far beyond anything a single pilot could accomplish independently. She found herself caught between competing emotions: pride in her father's courage and commitment to protecting innocent people, anger at the lies that had shaped her understanding of his disappearance, and a growing fear about what other secrets these documents might contain. Reading classified materials was a federal crime for someone without proper clearance, but the afternoon light was fading when she finally set the last document aside, her mind reeling with the scope of what she'd uncovered. Operation Nightfall represented a side of military operations that she'd suspected existed, but had never seen documented with such detail. Her father had been part of something that operated in the shadows between official policy and moral necessity, saving people whose lives had no strategic value, but whose humanity demanded action. Outside, the Colorado forest maintained its peaceful silence, giving no indication that it sheltered secrets that could reshape understanding of conflicts that had ended decades ago. Boone raised his head occasionally to check on her, sensing her emotional turmoil, but offering the quiet companionship that had sustained her through other difficult revelations. As darkness settled over the mountains, Lena carefully returned the documents to their waterproof container, knowing that she now carried information that people had died to protect. Her father's disappearance was no longer a simple tragedy of war. It was connected to operations that challenged the official narrative of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Tomorrow, she would return to the helicopter with new questions and a deeper understanding of what she might find there. Tonight, she would sit with the weight of secrets that her father had carried alone, wondering how many other families had received sanitized explanations for losses that were actually connected to operations that couldn't be acknowledged. The truth, she was beginning to realize, was far more complex and dangerous than the comfortable fiction she'd been living with for 40 years. The next morning brought clouds that threatened rain, but Lena was determined to explore the helicopter more thoroughly. Armed with additional supplies and a renewed sense of purpose, she made her way back to the hidden clearing, with Boone trailing behind at his measured pace. The classified documents had given her context, but she needed to understand the personal story that lay beneath the official operations. The cockpit area proved more accessible than she'd expected, the pilot's door yielding to persistent effort with the crowbar. As she climbed into the left seat where her father would have spent countless hours, she was struck by how much smaller the space felt than the helicopters she'd flown. The instrument panel was older, more analog than digital, requiring a level of skill and intuition that modern pilots rarely developed. It was in the small storage compartment behind the pilot's seat that she found the most significant discovery yet: her father's flight jacket, carefully folded and wrapped in a protective plastic bag that had somehow kept it in remarkable condition. The leather was worn but supple, bearing the distinctive patches and insignia of his squadron, along with the name tape that read J. Rowe in faded block letters. As she lifted the jacket from its storage place, the scent hit her immediately, a combination of leather, aviation fuel, and something distinctly masculine that she remembered from childhood hugs and rare moments of affection. For a moment she was 8 years old again, standing in the doorway of his study while he prepared for another deployment, wanting to ask him to stay but lacking the courage to voice what they both knew was impossible. Jacket contained additional treasures in its pockets: a worn maintenance log written in her father's meticulous handwriting, a small notebook filled with navigation calculations and fuel consumption figures, and a photograph that made her heart stop. It showed her father standing next to this very helicopter, but he wasn't alone. A small group of Asian civilians stood beside him, including children who couldn't have been older than she'd been when he disappeared. The maintenance log told a story of mechanical improvisation and field repairs that spoke to desperate circumstances. Entries detailed jury-rigged solutions to equipment failures, modifications made with salvaged parts, and fuel consumption calculations that suggested flights far longer than standard military operations would require. The final entry was dated just 2 days before his official disappearance, noting concerns about hydraulic pressure and a plan to address the issue during the next maintenance cycle. Next maintenance cycle, she murmured to herself, running her finger over his familiar handwriting. You knew you were coming back, but something had prevented that return. Something that had left this helicopter abandoned in a Colorado forest while the official records claimed he'd gone down in Southeast Asia. The logistics of moving a military aircraft across thousands of miles without detection suggested resources and planning that went far beyond anything her father could have accomplished alone. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly, showing a number she recognized but hadn't seen in weeks. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, Lena answered. "Mom." Sarah's voice carried the careful neutrality that had characterized their conversations since the divorce proceedings began. "I've been trying to reach you. Marcus said you'd gone to Grandpa's old place." "I needed some time away," Lena replied, settling back against the helicopter's fuselage while Boone positioned himself in the shade nearby. "How did you know where to find me?" "The property management company said you'd picked up the keys." "Mom, are you okay?" "This isn't like you to just disappear without telling anyone." The irony of her daughter's words wasn't lost on her, given what she'd been discovering about her own father's disappearance. "I'm fine. Sarah, I just needed some space to think about what comes next." "What comes next is figuring out how to repair the damage you've done to this family." Sarah's voice carried an edge that cut deeper than intended. "David hasn't spoken to either of us since the divorce was finalized, and I'm tired of being the only one who tries to hold things together." Lena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generational patterns that seemed destined to repeat themselves. "I know I've made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Mom, you've spent my entire life choosing duty over family, just like Grandpa did with you. And now you're doing it again, running away to his cabin instead of dealing with the mess you've made." The accusation hung in the mountain air, carrying truth that Lena wasn't ready to face directly. She looked at the photograph in her hand, her father surrounded by people he'd risked everything to save, and wondered if the parallels her daughter drew were as simple as they seemed. "Sarah, there are things about your grandfather that you don't understand. I understand that he abandoned his family for his sense of duty, and I understand that you've done the same thing. The reasons don't matter to the people who get left behind." The line went quiet for a long moment, filled with the weight of accumulated grievances and missed opportunities for understanding. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer but no less pointed. "I'm not saying this to hurt you, Mom. I'm saying it because I still hope there's time to fix things between us. But you have to want to fix them. And that means being present instead of hiding in the mountains, thinking about a man who's been gone for 40 years. After the call ended, Lena sat in the silence of the forest, holding her father's jacket and feeling the crushing weight of parallel failures. Her daughter was right about the patterns, about the way duty had become a substitute for the harder work of maintaining relationships that required daily attention, rather than heroic gestures. But she was beginning to understand that her father's story was more complex than simple abandonment. The documents she'd found suggested a man torn between impossible choices, trying to honor commitments that conflicted with each other in ways that offered no clean resolution. The people in the photograph had depended on him for their lives, just as she and her mother had depended on him for their security and happiness. The maintenance log contained additional insights that painted a picture of someone preparing for a specific mission while also planning for a future that assumed successful completion. Calculations for a return flight to Colorado, notes about modifications that would improve the helicopter's performance for civilian use, and a reminder to pick up a birthday gift for his daughter, her birthday. She counted backward from the date of the final log entry and realized that he'd been planning to return in time for her 18th birthday, an event that had come and gone without celebration while they waited for news of his fate. As the afternoon wore on and rain began to fall in earnest, Lena made her way back to the cabin with her father's jacket folded carefully under her arm. The scent of leather and old memories filled the car, making the drive back feel like a journey through time rather than distance. That evening, she spread the contents of the maintenance log across the dining table, studying the progression of entries and looking for clues about what had prevented his planned return. The answers were there, she was certain, hidden in the careful notations of a pilot who documented everything, because in aviation, small details often meant the difference between success and disaster. Outside, the Colorado night settled over the mountains with the promise of more rain to come, washing the forest clean while leaving its secrets intact. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening with droplets that caught the early sunlight like tiny prisms. Lena approached the helicopter site with a different mindset, no longer feeling like an intruder, but more like an investigator following a trail that was finally beginning to make sense. Boone seemed to share her determination, moving with more energy than he'd shown in recent days. She'd spent most of the previous evening studying the maintenance log, cross-referencing dates and locations with the classified documents she'd found. A pattern was emerging, a series of increasingly dangerous missions, culminating in something that required extensive preparation and modification of his aircraft. The final entries suggested he was preparing for an operation unlike anything he'd attempted before. Today, she planned to explore the cockpit more thoroughly, particularly the areas she hadn't been able to access during her initial investigation. The pilot's console contained numerous compartments and storage areas that might hold additional information about her father's final missions. It was while examining the space beneath the instrument panel that her flashlight beam caught the reflection of something metallic wedged behind a bundle of wiring. Careful extraction revealed a small digital recording device, the kind used for mission debriefings and personal logs. The device was an older model but appeared to be in good condition, protected by the aircraft's interior from the worst effects of weather and time. The recorder's battery was long dead, but Lena had brought a portable power bank from the cabin, anticipating the need to power various devices she might discover. As the recorder came to life, its display showing multiple audio files stored in memory, her hands began to shake with the realization of what she might be about to hear. Her father's voice, unchanged by the decades that had passed since his disappearance, filled the cockpit with the crisp, professional tone she remembered from her childhood. Personal log. Captain James Rowe, 15th of September 1983. Mission briefing for Operation Nightfall 7 complete. We have confirmation that the Nguyen family and 17 other civilians are pinned down in a village approximately 40 kilometers northwest of our last extraction point. Intelligence indicates enemy forces are conducting systematic elimination of anyone suspected of providing assistance to American operations. Lena's breath caught as she heard the familiar cadence of his speech, the careful way he pronounced each word when discussing serious matters. She was 8 years old again, listening from the hallway as he spoke on the telephone with military contacts, his voice carrying the weight of responsibilities she couldn't understand. The extraction window is narrow, 12 hours maximum before enemy reinforcements arrive. Standard protocol would be to classify this as too high risk for the potential intelligence value. But these people trusted us. They put their families in danger because they believed we would protect them if things went bad. The recording paused, and she could hear the sound of papers rustling, the distant noise of aircraft operations, and her father's heavy sigh before he continued. I've modified the bird for extended range and additional passengers. Henderson thinks I'm crazy, says the risk-to-benefit ratio doesn't justify the mission. Maybe he's right from a strategic standpoint, but strategy doesn't account for the look in a child's eyes when they realize the people they trusted might not be coming back for them. Lena found herself leaning forward, hanging on every word, as her father's voice brought his presence into the cockpit so vividly that she almost expected to see him in the co-pilot seat. The professional military bearing was there, but underneath it she could hear something she'd never recognized as a child, the moral burden of making life-and-death decisions about people, whose names would never appear in official reports. Lena's birthday is next week, his voice continued, softer now, more personal. 18 years old. When I get back from this mission, I'm going to tell her how proud I am of the young woman she's becoming. I'm going to explain why these deployments have been necessary, why some fights are worth the cost, even when they can't be acknowledged. Tears began streaming down her face as she heard the love and pride in his voice. Emotions that he'd never been able to express directly during the brief time they'd had together. The recording captured a side of her father that she'd only glimpsed in moments, the man behind the soldier, struggling to balance duty with the desire to be present for the people he loved. If something happens to me on this mission, I want her to know that every choice I've made has been about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Sometimes that means being away from the people you love most, but that doesn't mean you love them any less. The recording shifted to what was clearly a mission briefing, her father's voice returning to its professional tone as he outlined flight plans, emergency procedures, and contingency plans for various scenarios. The level of detail was extraordinary, suggesting preparation for a mission that carried significant risk of failure or compromise. Primary extraction point is a clearing approximately 2 kilometers east of the village. If the LZ is compromised, secondary extraction point is the riverbank 4 kilometers south. Weather looks good, but monsoon season is approaching and conditions can change rapidly. As she listened to him work through the logistics of saving nearly 20 civilians from certain death, Lena began to understand the impossible position her father had been in. These weren't random humanitarian missions. They were extraction operations for people who had risked everything to help American forces, only to find themselves abandoned when official policy shifted. Final equipment check complete. Bird is ready, crew is briefed, and intelligence indicates we have a narrow window of opportunity. These people have been waiting for 3 days while we figured out how to reach them without creating an international incident. The recording ended abruptly, leaving the cockpit filled with silence that seemed to echo with her father's words. Lena sat motionless for several minutes, processing the emotional impact of hearing his voice again and the revelations about his final mission. This wasn't the story of a soldier who had abandoned his family. This was the story of a man who had died trying to honor commitments that pulled him in impossible directions. She played the recording again, this time focusing on the technical details and timeline references that might provide clues about what had happened after he made these notes. The mission he described was clearly the one from which he never returned. But the helicopter sat here in Colorado rather than in Southeast Asia, suggesting events far more complex than simple combat loss. Boone had positioned himself near the cockpit door, seeming to sense the emotional weight of what she was experiencing. His presence was comforting as she struggled to reconcile the father she remembered, distant, duty-focused, frequently absent, with the man revealed in this recording who had been trying to save lives while planning to return home in time for his daughter's birthday. The voice recorder contained other files, additional mission logs and personal reflections that would require careful study. But she'd heard enough for now to understand that her father's disappearance wasn't the result of routine military operations gone wrong. He'd been engaged in missions that walked the line between official policy and moral necessity, saving people whose survival depended on operations that couldn't be acknowledged. As she made her way back to the cabin, carrying the recorder and its precious cargo of her father's voice, Lena felt something shifting in her understanding of family legacy and the weight of choices that defined a life. Her conversation with Sarah the previous day had focused on patterns of abandonment, but the reality was far more complex. Her father hadn't left his family by choice. He'd been killed, trying to keep promises to people whose lives depended on his courage and skill. The third day of exploration began, with Boone showing obvious signs of the stress their forest expeditions were placing on his aging body. He moved slowly from his bed by the fireplace, his joints stiff and his breathing labored in a way that reminded Lena of her own mortality and the urgency of the questions she was trying to answer. Still, he insisted on accompanying her to the helicopter site, his loyalty overriding his physical discomfort. She'd spent the previous evening listening to the remaining audio files on the recorder, each one adding layers to her understanding of her father's final missions. The recordings revealed a pilot who was increasingly concerned about the humanitarian cost of leaving intelligence assets and their families to face certain death when political considerations prevented official rescue operations. Today's search focused on areas of the helicopter she hadn't yet examined thoroughly, the crew compartment and the various storage areas that might contain additional evidence of her father's activities. It was in a small cargo net suspended from the ceiling that she made another significant discovery, a second set of military dog tags. Tarnished but still readable, LT, Marcus Webb, B. Neg, Catholic. The name triggered a memory from one of the audio recordings. Her father had mentioned Henderson, but there had been other names as well, crew members who had participated in the covert extraction missions. Webb's dog tags suggested he had been part of her father's team, but his presence in the helicopter raised new questions about the circumstances of their disappearance. The serial number on the tags provided a starting point for research, and back at the cabin, Lena used her limited internet connection to search military databases and veteran websites for information about Lieutenant Marcus Webb. What she found painted a picture that aligned with her growing understanding of Operation Nightfall's scope and human cost. Marcus Webb had been officially listed as killed in action during the same time period as her father's disappearance. His helicopter reportedly shot down during a reconnaissance mission in Laos, but the official records were sparse, lacking the detail typically associated with combat losses. Like her father's case, Webb's death seemed to have been explained with the minimum information necessary to satisfy administrative requirements. Further research revealed that Webb had been a co-pilot and medic, specialized in emergency medical procedures and extraction operations in hostile territory. His service record indicated multiple commendations for missions that were described in vague terms, suggesting involvement in operations that couldn't be fully documented. In official channels, a veterans forum provided additional insight when she found a thread discussing missing personnel from Southeast Asian operations. Several contributors mentioned rumors about crews who had volunteered for missions so classified that their losses couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. The discussion was filled with speculation and second-hand information, but the pattern matched what she was discovering about her father's activities. Returning to the helicopter with this new information, Lena conducted a more systematic search for additional evidence of crew members and mission details. In a sealed compartment behind the co-pilot's seat, she found a collection of photographs that provided faces to match the names she'd been uncovering. The images showed her father with 3 other men in flight gear, standing beside the helicopter in what appeared to be a forward operating base. One of the men matched the physical description from Webb's service record, and the timestamp on the photographs corresponded with the final weeks before her father's disappearance. But it was another photograph that stopped her completely, a group shot that included not just the American crew, but several Asian civilians, including the children she'd seen in the earlier photograph from her father's jacket. The composition suggested these weren't random encounters, but ongoing relationships. People who had become more than mission, objectives to the men risking their lives to protect them. Her father's expression in the photographs revealed something she'd never seen during his brief visits home, a sense of purpose and belonging that went beyond military duty. He looked like a man who had found his calling, even if that calling required him to operate in moral gray areas that official policy couldn't acknowledge. The physical evidence was building a compelling case for understanding her father's disappearance, but she needed official documentation to confirm her theories. Despite the risks of drawing attention to classified operations, she decided to contact the Military Records Office to request information about Operation Nightfall and the personnel involved. The phone call to the National Personnel Records Center was predictably frustrating. The clerk was polite, but firm about the limitations of information available to family members, particularly regarding operations that might still be classified after 40 years. However, she did confirm that both Captain James Rowe and Lieutenant Marcus Webb had been assigned to the same helicopter squadron and had been declared missing. In action during the same incident, I can provide you with the basic casualty report, the clerk offered, but any operational details would require special authorization. And honestly, ma'am, most of those records were either destroyed in the 1973 fire or remain classified under national security provisions. The mention of destroyed records was significant. The 1973 fire at the National Personnel Records Center had conveniently eliminated documentation for millions of service members, making it impossible to verify details about operations that might prove embarrassing to subsequent administrations. Boone's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the day, his movements becoming increasingly labored and his breathing showing signs of distress that worried her. She'd seen enough aging military working dogs to recognize the signs of systemic decline, the way loyal animals pushed themselves beyond their physical limits rather than let down their handlers. That evening, she sat with him by the fireplace, running her fingers through his graying coat while studying the photographs and documents spread across the coffee table. The evidence painted a clear picture of men who had chosen to risk everything for people whose survival depended on operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. "What do you think, old boy?" she asked Boone, who lifted his head to meet her gaze, with eyes that still held intelligence despite his physical decline. "Should we keep digging, or have we learned enough to understand what really happened?" But even as she asked the question, she knew the answer. Webb's dog tags suggested that her father hadn't been alone when he disappeared, and the photographs indicated ongoing relationships with the people they'd been trying to save. The official story of a reconnaissance mission gone wrong was clearly fiction, but she still didn't understand how the helicopter had ended up in Colorado, or what had happened to the rest of the crew. The next phase of her investigation would require reaching out to other families who had lost loved ones in similar circumstances, people who might have received the same sanitized explanations and who might be willing to share information that could complete the picture. But first, she needed to ensure that Boone received the veterinary attention his condition demanded. Some answers she was learning required patience and persistence that matched the scope of the secrets being uncovered. Her father and his crew had been part of something larger than individual heroism. They'd been part of a network of people who had chosen to act on moral imperatives that transcended official policy. The question now was whether she was prepared to follow that investigation wherever it might lead, even if it meant challenging official narratives that had been carefully maintained for decades. The veterinarian's office in town had confirmed Lena's fears about Boone's condition: advanced heart disease that would require careful management and limited activity. The diagnosis added urgency to her investigation, as if her loyal companion's declining health was somehow connected to the secrets she was uncovering about her father's disappearance. Returning to the helicopter site with this new weight of impending loss, Lena approached her search with renewed determination. She'd been systematic in her previous explorations, but today she decided to examine areas that seemed purely structural, looking for hidden compartments or modifications that might have escaped initial detection. It was this methodical approach that led her to notice an irregularity in the cargo bay flooring, a section that didn't quite align with the surrounding panels, suggesting a modification made after the aircraft's manufacture. Using her multi-tool to remove what appeared to be standard fasteners, she discovered that the entire section lifted away to reveal a carefully concealed compartment. The hidden space contained items that had been deliberately protected from discovery, wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof material and secured with military-grade packaging designed to survive decades of environmental exposure. As she carefully unwrapped the contents, her hands trembling with anticipation, She found documents that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her father's fate. The most significant discovery was a sealed letter addressed simply to my family in her father's unmistakable handwriting. The envelope had been sealed with wax and wrapped in additional protective layers, suggesting someone who intended for it to survive long enough to eventually reach its intended recipients. Sitting in the forest, clearing with Boone resting in the shade nearby, Lena opened the letter with the careful reverence of someone handling a message from the dead. Her father's words, written in the precise script she remembered from childhood, reached across 4 decades to finally explain the questions that had shaped her entire adult life. If you are reading this, then somehow you have found your way to the truth about what happened to me in Southeast Asia. I pray that it is Lena who discovers this letter, because she will understand the weight of the choices I had to make and the reasons why I could never come home. The letter was dated 3 months after his official disappearance, written with the careful detail of someone who knew his words might be the only explanation his family would ever receive. As she read, the official story of a helicopter crash and presumed death crumbled away, replaced by a reality far more complex and morally challenging. The mission to extract the Guyen family and other civilians was successful, in that we reached them before enemy forces could complete their systematic elimination of anyone who had helped American operations. But our helicopter was damaged during the extraction, forcing us to land in territory where no official rescue operation could be mounted without creating an international incident. Her father's account described a scenario where military pragmatism collided with human necessity. The damaged helicopter could have been repaired enough for the crew to escape, but not while carrying the civilian passengers who would be killed if left behind. Official policy prohibited risking additional resources for people who weren't American citizens or valuable intelligence assets. Webb, Patterson, and Chen all understood the choice we faced. We could abandon the people who had trusted us, repair the bird, and return to report a successful reconnaissance mission. Or we could stay with them, help them reach safety, and accept that we would never be able to return to our previous lives. The letter described a decision made collectively by the crew, not imposed by her father alone. All 4 men had chosen to sacrifice their official existence rather than abandon people whose survival depended on their protection. It was a choice that honored military values of loyalty and protection, while violating military policy that prioritized strategic considerations over individual lives. The hardest part was knowing that this choice meant never seeing you and your mother again. Never being able to explain why duty sometimes requires sacrifices that can't be acknowledged or honored through official channels. I wanted to be at your high school graduation, to walk you down the aisle when you found someone worthy of your love, to meet my grandchildren and tell them stories about their grandfather. Lena found herself crying as she read his words, finally understanding that his absence hadn't been abandonment, but the most profound sacrifice a father could make, giving up his own family to protect other families who had no one else to turn to. The emotional weight of his choice was overwhelming, but it also answered questions that had haunted her for decades. We helped the civilians reach a remote village where they could rebuild their lives without fear of retribution. The village elders offered us sanctuary, understanding that we could never leave without putting everyone at risk. Over time, we became part of the community, using our skills to help build schools, establish medical facilities, and train local people in agricultural techniques that improved their survival prospects. The letter described a life that her father had built in exile, contributing to a community that had welcomed him despite the dangers his presence might create. He'd become a teacher, a medic, and a protector for people who had already lost everything to war and political upheaval. Webb established a medical clinic that serves 3 villages. Patterson became a teacher, helping children learn English and basic engineering principles. Chen organized agricultural projects that have improved food security for hundreds of families. We found purpose in helping people rebuild their lives, even as we mourned the lives we could never return to. The practical details of their exile revealed careful planning and resource management that allowed them to contribute meaningfully to their adopted community. They'd use skills developed through military training to address civilian needs, creating value that justified the risks their presence created for local people. I want you to know that every day I thought about you and your mother, wondering how you were growing up, whether you were happy. If you ever thought about me with anything other than anger or disappointment, I hope that someday you will understand that choosing to protect innocent people, even at the cost of our own happiness, was the right thing to do. The letter continued with specific details about the village location, descriptions of the people they'd helped, and instructions for how the helicopter had been transported to Colorado through a network of veterans who understood the moral complexity of their situation. The logistics alone suggested a support system that had enabled their choice while protecting the official fiction of their deaths. This helicopter contains evidence of missions that saved hundreds of lives, operations that couldn't be acknowledged because they violated policies designed to limit American involvement in regional conflicts. We were proud to be part of that work, even knowing the personal cost. The final pages of the letter focused on her father's hopes for his family's future, his pride in Lena's military aspirations, and his regret about the pain his disappearance had caused. He'd written with the knowledge that he would never be able to deliver these words personally, making them both a confession and a final gift. If you have found this letter, then I am probably gone, having lived a different life than the one I planned, but having died knowing that my choices mattered to people who had no other hope. I hope you can forgive me for choosing duty over family, for valuing the lives of strangers over your need for a father who was present for the ordinary moments that matter most. Lena set the letter aside when she finished reading, overwhelmed by the complete recontextualization of her father's absence. He hadn't abandoned his family for military glory or career advancement. He'd sacrificed everything to honor commitments that transcended national boundaries and official policies. The supporting documents in the hidden compartment provided additional details about the network of veterans who had helped transport the helicopter to Colorado, the village where her father had lived his remaining years, and the people whose lives had been saved through operations that officially never existed. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the forest clearing, Lena began to understand that she'd been living with a fundamental misunderstanding of her father's character and choices. The distant, duty-focused man she remembered had been struggling with moral dilemmas that offered no easy resolution, ultimately choosing to honor his commitments to vulnerable people, even when it meant losing everything that mattered to him personally. Boone stirred from his rest to nuzzle her hand, seeming to sense the emotional weight of what she'd discovered. Tomorrow, she would need to decide what to do with this knowledge, whether to keep it private or to share it with others who might benefit from understanding the truth about operations that had saved lives at enormous personal cost. For now, it was enough to finally know that her father's absence had been motivated by love rather than indifference, by courage rather than cowardice, and by a sense of duty that extended far beyond the narrow confines of official policy. The letter had answered the central question of her father's disappearance, but it had also created a new imperative that Lena couldn't ignore. If his account was accurate, there might be people still living who remembered Captain James Rowe and could provide verification of the story he'd written in careful detail. More importantly, there might be a grave site where she could finally pay her respects to a father whose sacrifice she was only now beginning to understand. Back at the cabin, she spread the contents of the hidden compartment across the dining table, studying the additional documents that had accompanied her father's letter. Among them was a hand-drawn map, sketched in his precise drafting style, showing the location of the village where he'd spent his final years. The map included geographical markers, distances between landmarks, and detailed notes about the terrain that spoke to his pilot's training in navigation and reconnaissance. The village was marked as being approximately 40 kilometers northwest of Phong Sali in northern Laos, accessible only by foot or motorcycle from the nearest road. His notes indicated a population of roughly 300 people, primarily ethnic minorities, who had fled from other regions during the various conflicts that had swept through Southeast Asia. It was exactly the kind of remote community that could provide sanctuary for Americans who needed to disappear from official records, but verifying his story would require traveling halfway around the world to a region that remained politically sensitive 4 decades after the end of the Vietnam War. The logistics alone presented significant challenges, and the emotional risks were even greater. What if she traveled all that way, only to discover that the village no longer existed, or that no one remembered her father, or that his account had been the confused recollections of a man under extreme stress? Her first step was to contact military historians and veterans organizations that specialized in Southeast Asian operations, hoping to find someone with knowledge of the covert missions described in her father's documents. The initial responses were discouraging. Most officials cited security classifications and privacy concerns when asked about specific personnel or operations. However, a breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Chen, a historian at the Army War College who specialized in unconventional warfare, responded to Lena's carefully worded inquiry with interest rather than deflection. When Lena mentioned finding documents related to Operation Nightfall, Dr. Chen asked to schedule a secure phone conversation. "I've been researching those operations for 20 years, Dr. Chen explained during their call. Most of the official records were destroyed or remain classified, but I've interviewed dozens of veterans who participated in similar missions. Your father's name has come up in several accounts, always described as someone who pushed the boundaries of official policy to protect civilian assets." Dr. Chen's research had uncovered a pattern of covert humanitarian operations that had operated parallel to official military objectives throughout the Southeast Asian conflicts. These missions had saved thousands of lives, but had been deliberately excluded from historical records to protect ongoing intelligence operations and avoid diplomatic complications. "If you're serious about verifying your father's account," Dr. Chen continued, "I can put you in touch with organizations that help families locate missing service members in Southeast Asia. They work with local governments and village leaders to investigate cases that fell through official channels." The conversation with Dr. Chen provided both validation and direction for her investigation. Within a week, she was in contact with a non-profit organization that specialized in locating missing American personnel and had extensive networks throughout Laos and Vietnam. Their representative, a former military intelligence officer named Frank Morrison, offered to help coordinate a fact-finding mission to the region described in her father's map. "I'll be honest with you," Morrison told her during their initial meeting in Denver. "The area you're talking about is remote and hasn't been thoroughly documented by outside researchers. But we have local contacts who know the village histories. And if your father spent significant time there, someone will remember him." The planning process forced Lena to confront the emotional reality of what she was proposing. This wouldn't be a simple verification exercise. It would be a pilgrimage to her father's final resting place, a journey that would either confirm his account and provide closure or shatter the understanding she'd finally achieved about his choices and character. The most unexpected development came through a phone call from Sarah, whose tone carried none of the anger or frustration that had characterized their recent conversations. "Mom, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I owe you an apology. Marcus told me you've been investigating something about Grandpa, and I realize I've been unfair about your need to understand what happened to him." Lena was careful in her response, not wanting to raise expectations about discoveries that might not lead to the resolution Sarah seemed to hope for. I've found some information that suggests his disappearance was more complicated than we were told. But I'm still trying to verify the details. I want to help, Sarah said, her voice carrying a determination that reminded Lena of her own stubborn pursuit of difficult truths. I know I said some harsh things about patterns and abandonment, but maybe understanding why he left will help us figure out how to avoid repeating those patterns ourselves. The offer caught Lena completely off guard. Sarah had shown little interest in family history beyond the ways it had affected her own childhood, and the idea of her accompanying an investigation trip to Southeast Asia seemed both impractical and potentially dangerous. Sarah, this isn't a casual research project. I'm talking about traveling to remote villages in a country that doesn't exactly welcome American investigations of military activities from 40 years ago. The logistics are complicated, and there's no guarantee we'll find anything useful. Then we'll figure it out together, Sarah replied, with the same persistence she'd inherited from both her mother and grandfather. I've been thinking about what you said about duty and sacrifice, and maybe I need to understand those concepts better before I judge the choices people make when they're trying to do the right thing. As they discuss the practical aspects of international travel and the emotional challenges of investigating family history, Lena realized that Sarah's offer represented an opportunity for healing that went beyond simply finding answers about her father. This could be a chance to bridge the gap between generations, to share the weight of difficult truths rather than carrying them alone. The urgency of their mission became even more apparent when Boone's condition took a turn for the worse. The veterinarian's examination revealed that his heart disease had progressed more rapidly than expected, and his quality of life was beginning to decline noticeably. The prognosis suggested weeks rather than months, making every decision about timing and priorities more poignant. He's been your companion through all of this discovery, the veterinarian observed as they discussed treatment options that would keep Boone comfortable without extending suffering. Sometimes animals seem to hold on until their people reach important milestones. Maybe he's waiting for you to complete whatever journey you've started. That evening, as Lena sat with Boone by the fireplace, studying her father's map and the logistical requirements for traveling to Laos, she felt the weight of multiple timelines converging. Her investigation had reached the point where only physical verification could provide the closure she needed. But that verification required leaving Boone when he needed her most. Sarah's voice on the phone that night carried understanding rather than pressure. "Mom, if this trip is important enough to risk everything for, then it's important enough for me to help you make it happen. And if Boone's time is limited, then maybe the best thing we can do is give him the peace of knowing you've found the answers you've been searching for." The planning intensified over the following days, with Morrison coordinating local contacts while Lena and Sarah researched travel requirements and health precautions for remote regions of Laos. The map became their primary navigation tool, with GPS coordinates calculated from her father's landmark. Notations and backup routes identified in case political or weather conditions prevented access to their primary destination. As departure preparations reached their final stages, Lena found herself returning to the helicopter site one last time with Boone, who insisted on making the walk despite his obvious discomfort. They sat together in the forest clearing where this journey had begun, surrounded by the evidence of her father's choices and the weight of decisions that had shaped 3 generations of their family. "We're going to find him, old boy," she told Boone, running her fingers through his graying coat while studying the aircraft that had somehow brought her father's story home to Colorado. "We're going to learn whether his sacrifice meant what he thought it meant, and we're going to make sure that the people he saved know that his family finally understands why he stayed." The map in her hands represented more than geographical guidance. It was a roadmap to understanding how duty and love could coexist even when they seemed to pull in opposite directions. Tomorrow, she and Sarah would begin a journey that would either confirm her father's account or force them to accept that some questions could never be answered satisfactorily. But tonight, in the peaceful silence of the Colorado forest, she allowed herself to hope that the truth would prove worthy of the 40-year search it had required. The answers she sought were contained not just in documents and recordings, but in the memories of people who had been touched by her father's courage and compassion during his years of exile. Whatever they found in the mountains of Laos, it would complete a story that had begun with a helicopter crash and had somehow led to this clearing where military hardware had become a memorial to choices that transcended official policy and national boundaries. The heat hit them like a physical wall as they stepped off the plane in Vientiane. The humid air carrying scents of diesel fuel, cooking spices, and tropical vegetation that immediately transported Lena back to her own deployments in hot climates. Sarah adjusted her backpack with the careful movements of someone still learning to navigate international travel. But her determination hadn't wavered during the 20-hour journey from Denver. Their contact, a local guide named Calm, who worked with Morrison's organization, met them at the airport with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to helping families search for answers in a country where the past remained politically sensitive. He spoke excellent English and had spent years helping American families locate missing service members, understanding both the emotional weight of their missions and the practical challenges of accessing remote regions. The village you seek is called Ban Pha Luang. Tam explained as they drove through the dusty streets of Vientiane toward their hotel. It means Golden Mountain Village in our language. The road ends 20 kilometers away, and then we must use motorcycles or walk. But the village elder remembers an American pilot who lived there many years ago. The confirmation that someone remembered her father sent a surge of adrenaline through Lena's system, the same heightened awareness she'd experienced before important missions. After months of investigation based on documents and recordings, they were finally approaching verification from living witnesses who had known her father personally. The next morning brought a 5-hour drive through increasingly rural terrain, past rice paddies and small towns that seemed untouched by the decades of development that had transformed other parts of Southeast Asia. Sarah documented their journey with photographs, her initial nervousness giving way to fascination with landscapes and cultures she'd only encountered in history books. The final leg of their journey required switching to motorcycles. With Calm and a local driver navigating mountain trails that tested Lena's trust in their expertise. The terrain was challenging but beautiful, with dense jungle giving way to clearings where villages clung to hillsides, like organic growths emerging from the landscape itself. Ban Pha Luang appeared gradually through the trees, a collection of traditional wooden houses built on stilts with corrugated metal roofs that reflected the afternoon sun. Children stopped their games to stare at the unexpected visitors, while adults emerged from houses and workshops to observe the arrival of 2 American women who had traveled so far to reach their remote community. The village elder, a dignified man in his 70s named Baunmi, greeted them with formal courtesy and genuine curiosity about their purpose. Through Calm's translation, he confirmed that he remembered the American pilot who had lived in their village for several years before his death. He called himself James. Baunmi explained as they sat in the shade of a large tree that served as the village's informal meeting place. He came with 3 other Americans and a group of refugees from the lowlands. They were escaping from the war, and we gave them sanctuary because they had helped our people. The elder's account aligned perfectly with her father's letter, describing a group of Americans who had arrived with civilian refugees and had gradually integrated into the village community. Baunmi spoke with the measured pace of someone accustomed to preserving oral history, providing details that filled in gaps in her father's written account. James became our teacher and healer. He knew how to treat injuries and sickness, and he taught our children to read and write in English. He also helped us build a better school and showed us new ways to grow rice that increased our harvests. Other villagers gathered as word spread about the visitors' purpose, and several elderly residents shared memories of the American pilot who had become part of their community. Their stories painted a picture of a man who had found purpose in exile, contributing skills and knowledge that had improved life for the entire village. He never spoke much about his previous life, an elderly woman named Marley recalled. But sometimes at night he would look toward the mountains, and we knew he was thinking about family far away. He carried great sadness, but also great kindness. The most significant moment came when Bounmi disappeared into his house and returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, was a silver medal engraved with Vietnamese text and the image of a lotus flower. "We gave this to James 3 years before he died," Bounmi explained through Kam's translation. "It is our village's highest honor, given to those who have saved lives and brought prosperity to our people. We wanted him to know that he was valued and respected, that his sacrifices had meaning." Lena held the medal with trembling hands, feeling the weight of recognition that her father had received from people whose lives he had touched. The inscription, when translated, read, "For James, the American father who chose to stay and help his adopted children grow strong." As afternoon faded toward evening, the villagers shared stories about specific contributions her father had made. A medical clinic that still operated using techniques he had taught, agricultural improvements that continued to benefit their food security, and educational programs that had produced a generation of English-speaking young people who could navigate the modern world while maintaining their cultural traditions. He died peacefully, Bounmi assured them as they prepared to visit the village cemetery. He was working in the school garden when his heart stopped. "We buried him according to our customs, but also with respect for his American heritage." The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the village, marked by traditional burial mounds and carved wooden markers. But at the far end, under a large tree that provided afternoon shade, was a simple stone marker bearing both English and Lao text. The English inscription read, "Captain James Rowe, American pilot and teacher, 1943-1991. He came as a stranger and died as our father." Standing before her father's grave in the late afternoon light, Lena felt the weight of 40 years of questions finally lifting from her shoulders. The simple stone marker, weathered by decades of monsoon rains and tropical sun, represented the end of a search that had consumed most of her adult life. Sarah stood beside her, tears streaming down her face as she processed the reality of finding her grandfather's final resting place in a village that existed far from any map her childhood understanding could have imagined. The inscription in Lao script, which Kam translated with quiet reverence, told a story of adoption and belonging that transcended nationality and culture. The villagers had claimed her father as their own, honoring his memory not as a foreign soldier who had died in exile, but as a community leader who had chosen to dedicate his final years to their welfare and prosperity. Bounmi approached them with the careful respect of someone who understood the emotional significance of their pilgrimage. In his hands, he carried a collection of items that painted a vivid picture of her father's life in Ban Pa Luang. Photographs showing him teaching children, working in gardens, and participating in village ceremonies with the easy familiarity of someone who had found his place in the world. "Your father was a gifted teacher," Bounmi explained as they sat near the gravesite, sharing memories that brought James Rowe to life in ways that official military records never could. "He taught our children not just English and mathematics, but also critical thinking and problem-solving skills that helped them understand the world beyond our mountains." The photographs revealed a man who had aged gracefully in his adopted community, his hair turning white, but his posture remaining straight, and his eyes holding the kind of peace that had been absent from the military portraits Lena remembered from her childhood. He looked like someone who had found meaningful work and genuine belonging, even in circumstances that had required enormous personal sacrifice. "He established our first proper medical clinic," Marley added, joining their conversation with other elderly villagers who wanted to share their memories of the American pilot. He trained 3 of our young people to provide basic medical care, and those skills have saved many lives over the years. When the government health officials visit now, they are impressed by our medical knowledge. Sarah listened with growing amazement as the villagers described projects and initiatives that revealed her grandfather's continuing commitment to service, even in circumstances where his efforts would never be recognized by official channels. He had built schools, established agricultural programs, and created educational opportunities that had lifted the entire community's prospects for prosperity and self-sufficiency. Did he ever speak about his family in America? Sarah asked through Combs' translation, her voice carrying the hope and pain of someone finally understanding the grandfather she'd never known. Often, Banmi replied with gentle honesty, especially about his daughter, who had become a soldier like him. He was very proud of your mother's service, and he worried that she might blame herself for his disappearance. He wanted her to know that his choice to stay here was not a rejection of his love for his family. The confirmation of her father's continuing love and pride hit Lena with unexpected force, resolving guilt and anger that she'd carried for decades without fully acknowledging. He hadn't forgotten them or replaced them with his adopted community. He'd simply found a way to honor multiple commitments that had seemed irreconcilable. As evening approached, the villagers prepared a ceremonial meal in honor of their guests, treating Sarah and Lena not as tourists or researchers, but as family members who had finally come home. The celebration was simple but profound, featuring traditional foods and customs that welcomed them into the community that had embraced their father during his final years. During the meal, Bonmai presented them with a final gift, a journal that her father had kept during his years in the village, written in English and intended as a record of his experiences for any family members who might someday find their way to Ban Pha Luang. The journal contained detailed accounts of his daily activities, his thoughts about the community he'd joined, and his hopes for the people he'd left behind in America. He always believed that someone from his family would eventually discover the truth about his disappearance, Banmi explained. He wanted to be sure that if you found him, you would understand that his choice to remain here was motivated by love rather than abandonment. Reading excerpts from the journal by lamplight, Lena and Sarah discovered the inner life of a man who had faced impossible choices with dignity and courage. His writing revealed someone who had mourned his separation from family while finding new purpose in service to others, creating meaning from circumstances that could have easily led to despair or bitterness. The next morning, before beginning their journey back to Vientiane, they participated in a memorial ceremony at her father's grave. The entire village gathered to honor both the memory of the American pilot who had become their father and the arrival of his family members who had traveled so far to understand his story. As they prepared to leave Ban Pha Luang, Sarah took her mother's hand with a gesture that carried forgiveness and new understanding. "I see where you get your sense of duty," she said quietly. "And I'm beginning to understand that sometimes love requires choices that don't look like love from the outside. The journey home would require processing emotions and insights that challenge their previous understanding of family, duty, and sacrifice. But they would make that journey together, carrying the knowledge that their father and grandfather had lived his final years with purpose and dignity, honored by people whose lives he had touched with the same courage that had defined his military service. The Colorado mountains welcomed them home with the crisp air of early autumn, pine trees beginning their seasonal transformation, and the sky holding that particular clarity that only came with changing seasons. Lena and Sarah made the familiar drive from Denver in comfortable silence, both processing the emotional weight of their journey to Laos and the profound shift in understanding that had resulted from finding her father's grave. Boone greeted them at the cabin door with the careful enthusiasm of an old dog who had been waiting patiently for his person's return. His condition had remained stable during their absence, as if he had indeed been holding on until Lena could complete her pilgrimage. She knelt to embrace him, burying her face in his familiar coat while whispering updates about their discoveries and the peace she'd finally found. He lived well. "Old boy," she told him, her voice carrying the relief of someone who had finally laid decades-old ghosts to rest. "He found a way to serve and to love, even in exile. He never forgot us, and he died knowing that his choices had meaning." Sarah had insisted on accompanying her mother to the helicopter site, wanting to see the place where this journey of discovery had begun. They walked the forest path together, Sarah now understanding the significance of every document and artifact that had led them halfway around the world to find answers that had eluded their family for 40 years. The helicopter sat exactly as they'd left it, still covered by vines and moss, but now transformed in meaning from mysterious wreckage to sacred memorial. Sarah studied the aircraft with new eyes, recognizing it not as evidence of abandonment, but as proof of her grandfather's courage and the impossible choices that had defined his final years. "I want to help you create a proper memorial here," Sarah said, as they explored the clearing where Lena had first discovered the truth about her father's disappearance. "Something that honors not just his memory, but the story of all the people he saved, both the Americans who served with him and the civilians who found refuge through their sacrifice." They spent the afternoon discussing possibilities for preserving the site while protecting the sensitive nature of the operations it represented. The helicopter itself would remain in place, but they would add interpretive materials that told the story of Operation Nightfall and the humanitarian missions that had operated in the shadows of official military policy. Working together on the memorial plans created opportunities for conversations that addressed the generational patterns that had shaped their family relationships. Sarah's understanding of her grandfather's choices had shifted her perspective on her mother's military service and the sacrifices that duty sometimes required. From those who answered its call, "I've been angry about your absences and your emotional distance," Sarah admitted as they cleared vegetation from around the helicopter's memorial plaque. "But I never understood that you were trying to balance competing loyalties, just like Grandpa did. Maybe the problem wasn't that you chose duty over family. Maybe the problem was that we never learned how to talk about the weight of those choices." Their conversation continued as they worked, addressing years of accumulated misunderstandings and missed opportunities for connection. Lena found herself able to discuss her own struggles with balancing service and family, acknowledging mistakes while also explaining the context that had shaped her decisions. "Your father was a good man who deserved better than what I was able to give him," Lena said, her honesty carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I thought that strength meant carrying burdens alone, but I learned too late that real strength sometimes means asking for help and admitting when the weight is too much for one person." As evening approached, they returned to the cabin where Lena prepared dinner while Sarah worked on her laptop, researching organizations that preserved military history and honored veterans whose service couldn't be fully acknowledged through official channels. Their shared project had created a new dynamic between them, transforming their relationship from one burdened by resentment to one focused on collaborative healing. The meal was simple but significant, marking the first time in years that they'd shared food and conversation without the underlying tension that had characterized their interactions since Lena's divorce. Sarah's phone rang during dessert, David's name appearing on the screen in what felt like providential timing. "Mom wants to talk to you," Sarah said after a brief conversation with her brother. "I think it's time we all had an honest conversation about family and forgiveness and what we want our relationships to look like going forward." The phone call with David was tentative but promising, his curiosity about their discoveries in Laos creating an opening for discussions about family history and the patterns that had shaped their understanding of love and duty. He agreed to visit the cabin the following weekend, bringing his family to meet the grandmother they'd only known through carefully edited stories. That night, As Lena and Sarah sat by the fireplace with Boone resting peacefully between them, they looked through the photographs and documents that had brought them to this point of understanding. The faded military photograph of her father that had started this journey now sat beside recent pictures from their trip to Laos, creating a visual timeline that connected his military service to his final years of civilian contribution. "I want to frame this," Sarah said, holding up a photograph they'd taken together at her father's gravesite in Ban Pha Luang, "not just as a memorial, but as proof that families can find their way back to each other, even across decades and continents and misunderstandings that seemed impossible to bridge." The new family photograph would join the collection on the cabin's mantel, representing not just the end of their search for answers, but the beginning of relationships rebuilt on truth rather than assumption. Lena's father had found a way to honor competing loyalties through sacrifice and service, and now his family was learning to honor his memory by choosing connection over resentment, understanding over judgment. Outside, the Colorado forest settled into its nighttime rhythm, holding space for secrets revealed and healing begun. The helicopter would remain in its hidden clearing, transformed from mysterious wreckage into sacred ground where family members could visit to remember the man who had chosen love over safety, service over comfort, and truth over convenient fiction. In the morning, they would begin the practical work of establishing the memorial and sharing their discoveries with other families who might benefit from understanding the complex realities of service and sacrifice. But tonight, it was enough to sit together in the warmth of reconciliation, finally understanding that some journeys toward truth require generations to complete, but are worth every step of the difficult passage home.